kids were growing up, one of the things they often joked about is they'd said the definition of an adult is someone who has stopped growing at both ends and started growing around the middle. To some extent, by that criteria, American Jewry is regressing to almost infantile behavior. And let me try to flesh that out here in terms of the first question of, is there a crisis? And what are the dimensions of the crisis? Both of the ends of American Jewish life are increasing. Those who are Orthodox are increasing in numbers. Those who are unaffiliated are increasing in numbers. Where is the decrease? It's the so-called middles of Jewish life, which means identified conservative and Reform Jews. We'll come back to those middles, who are the key target population in any discussion of mixed marriage. But bear in mind, that's where a lot of the future of American Jewry will lie. As those two movements go, so will American Jewry go. Now, it's in this context that I'd like to begin by suggesting that intermarriage, this may be the most shocking thing, it is not entirely terrible. It's not entirely problematic. There are benefits of mixed marriage, and no one can deny that. Namely, that mixed marriage is a statement about how well integrated Jews are in American society, how acceptable Jews are in American society. Never in diaspora Jewish history has there been a society so willing to welcome Jewish participation as Jews. Mixed marriage is a barometer of that degree of acceptance. Now, this is oftentimes a hard message to absorb for two reasons. Number one, mixed marriage threatens the Jewish future for obvious reasons, and we'll take a look at that in greater detail. Second, American Jews have gotten used to the idea of a narrative in which we tell ourselves in one form or another, they don't want us, they don't like us, they accept us only grudgingly, we're marginal, there's always anti-Semitism. Even during the 2000 campaign for presidency, with Senator Joseph Lieberman was running as vice president, as a self-identified Orthodox Jew, countless people came forth telling me in one form or another, God forbid he should be elected, because there'll be a backlash against Jews, given that 50% of the population tend to be upset about government's policies under any circumstances. My usual response was, no, Lieberman's candidacy was a strong statement of how well Jews are accepted in American society. That is the blessing of America. What the price of that blessing is, what goes along with that degree of acceptance, that's where intermarriage becomes of crisis proportions. There's a second view that intermarriage is not a crisis because people feel we have the solutions. Those who argue that between birthright Israel on the one hand, bringing Jews to a trip to Israel, and special outreach programs to mixed married couples to enable them to lead a Jewish life, whatever the losses that will result from mixed marriage are, they will be contained, or some are even more optimistic. They will be transformed into opportunities for growth within the Jewish community. That's the second view, the view that there is no crisis, or if there is, it's a crisis that can be managed very well by programs and directions that we already have. I'd like to suggest that the crisis that does exist is at least threefold. It's a crisis numerically, demographically, if you will. It's a crisis institutionally, and last, it's a crisis normatively. What is the numerical crisis? Once you leave the Orthodox community, which again is growing by leaps and bounds, mainly in the Haredi sector of Orthodoxy. Once you leave the Orthodox community, the intermarriage rate over the last 15 years, say between 2000 and 2015, the intermarriage rate is at 71%, which means in effect, more than 7 out of 10 Jews who've gotten married in the last 15 years have married non-Jews without conversion to Judaism. The rates vary obviously by movement. Within the Orthodox community, it's 12.5%. That's mainly modern Orthodox. In the Haredi community, I'm not sure if I necessarily accept the data here, because anyone who's Haredi that married out probably argues he's no longer Haredi, or he may even deny that origin. The Haredi data that we have is very, very limited. It's based really on 137 respondents. If 1%, which is what was reported, if 1% married out, that means in effect less than one person married out over the last 15 years. Obviously that's not true, but you can put that aside and say that 12.5% among the modern Orthodox is a realistic figure. In the conservative movement, those who have been raised conservative, 2 Jewish parents raised conservative, gotten married in the last 15 years, it's 39%. In the Reform movement, 82%, and among the unaffiliated, 79%. Unless you raise the question of, does that mean Reform is, you're better off being unaffiliated than being Reform? 3 percentage points is usually simply statistically insignificant. In other words, the real point is that conservative rates are roughly half of Reform and unaffiliated rates. What happens to the children and grandchildren is where the numerical crisis becomes even more severe. 83% of children of mixed marrieds who've gotten married in the last 15 years have married non-Jews. Grandchildren of mixed marrieds, 92%. So that intermarriage becomes a spiraling crisis numerically. In general, only 20% of those who've married out make the claim that they are raising their children as Jews. Now, again, I wouldn't necessarily take a claim as being absolute. I would qualify it a little as saying, yes, that usually does mean they're giving some form of Jewish education. Then there's another 10%, in other words, the whole thing would be about 30%, who say we identify as Jews, but not as Jews by religion. In other words, we found some ethnic or peoplehood component by which we say we're of a Jewish family, or nature of a Jewish family. But the end result of this approaches crisis proportions. Since 1991, since 1990, if you compare the data over 25 years, 2.1 million Jews, born Jews, are no longer practicing Jews. In other words, if you look at intermarriage as the key barometer here, people marry out at large numbers. Their children, even larger numbers. Their grandchildren, almost 100%. You're going to lose people. And here the losses are quite considerable, as I say, 2.1 million. So that's the first dimension of the crisis. What I call the numerical aspect of it, it's a tragedy that we've lost 2 million Jews over the last 25 years. The institutional crisis is perhaps less obvious, but it's what I referred to earlier when I called the shrinking middles. The shrinking middles, the conservative reform movements, represent the architectural backbone of Jewish communal life. They are the ones who are mounting the case for Israel. They are the ones who are giving to Jewish federations. What I call the institutional backbone is that American Jewry has built an incredible network of Jewish communal organizations. We are more organized than any Jewish community known in history. I'd say when you talk about the crisis of mixed marriage, you're talking about a crisis of future Jewish organized commitment, future Jewish organized communal life, activism for Israel, Jewish philanthropy, social services. Those have all depended upon the backbone of the active conservative and reform Jews. As those two movements decline, the Jewish community will decline, or the Jewish people will decline. So in that sense, we have an institutional crisis. In effect, by the way, in terms of mixed marrieds and how they fit into this picture, if you looked at the barometer simply of a commitment to Israel, which is obviously not a religious issue per se, nor is it dependent upon having a Jewish spouse. Historically, there have always been pro-Israel activists who are not really identified within the Jewish community. In the current population of mixed marrieds, there's enormous disinterest in matters relating to Israel. There's tremendous dispute among the social scientists as to whether younger Jews are distancing themselves from Israel. The one point they both agree on is that once you factor in mixed marriage, then there is enormous distancing from Israel. In other words, you're looking at in-marrieds, there may be more distancing, there may be less distancing. But the point of agreement is that once you factor in mixed marrieds as a population, the distance from Israel increases significantly. The danger, obviously, is that if the cause of Israel becomes an Orthodox cause alone, that will be a tragedy for the Jewish people, a tragedy for the state of Israel, and frankly, a tragedy for American Jewry. But the third crisis is perhaps the one that we have only ourselves to blame for. It's the third crisis that is perhaps least noticeable, but at times we we refrain from talking about it lest we give offense, lest we drive away people who are otherwise interested. It's what I call the normative crisis. What is the normative crisis? Again, some data. Year 2000, the American Jewish Committee undertook a survey of attitudes towards mixed marriage. 56%, it's year 2000, I'm sure it's gone up since then. 56% responded to the survey by saying they would not be pained by the outmarriage of their progeny. Right away, a decline in the norm of in-marriage. 50% went much further and said it is, quote, racist to oppose mixed marriage. We live during an electoral climate right now where the term racism is being bandied about, and no one wants to be known as a racist. 50% of American Jews regard opposition to mixed marriage as racist. Perhaps even more surprising, 42%, just a little bit less than the 50%, favor co-officiation at mixed marriages between Jewish and Christian clergy. Now, in that sense, again, the long-standing taboo was don't have a priest and a rabbi married together. You know, that was regarded as somehow beyond the pale. That's more or less collapsed, or at least among 42% of the respondents, this was simply not a problem. The danger here, when I speak in terms of a normative crisis, the danger is that we become neutral on the question of in-marriage and endogamy. We become neutral even on conversion to Judaism. We simply say that because we don't wish to give any offense, we can't uphold two age-old Jewish values of encouraging in-marriage, and when mixed marriage occurs, the single best outcome is conversion to Judaism. When I speak in terms of this evolution of these two norms, and I say these two norms have collapsed on our watch, if you will, I say compare this with statements made a mere 25, 30 years ago. In 1978, Rabbi Alexander Schindler, in a landmark speech, which was historically significant because he restored conversion to the Jewish communal agenda. Talk of conversion was relatively rare in American Jewry any time before then. Rabbi Robert Gordis in 1972 had given such a landmark address as well, didn't have nearly as much pickup as Rabbi Schindler. Surprisingly, Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik, in an interview he gave a couple of years later, said that, again, I won't quote, I don't have it directly in front of me, but the words were more or less along the lines of, in this matter of mixed marriage, the way of reform is correct, namely to seek out converts to Judaism. 12 years later, in 1990, a very prominent lay leader of the reform movement, appearing for the American Jewish Committee, gave, again, a wonderful statement. He said, let us bring the mixed marrieds to the point where they reject mixed marriage for their progeny. In other words, let us bring them so close to Judaism that they will not want to see their children marrying out. Again, that was a statement of 1990, 25 years ago. It's rarely heard today. In that sense, we have what I call a normative crisis, that the twin values of endogamy, encouraging in marriage, and encouraging conversion as the single best outcome to a mixed marriage, those have fallen by the wayside in favor of a language which basically says, we are not prepared to close the door, which we're not. The question is, how can we somehow or other encourage them to raise Jewish children without necessarily emphasizing either in marriage or conversion, become neutral on those issues so as to enable mixed marrieds to raise children as Jews. The question then becomes what to do. And I'd like to suggest that there are at least 6 avenues that some are fairly obvious, some are much less obvious, but 6 avenues that the community needs to at least explore or consider. Number one is that there's a lot to be learned from the recent experience of Great Britain. Great Britain in the early 1980s had a mixed marriage rate of 26%. 2016, it's still 26%. In other words, obviously high, but nowhere near as high as the American rates, and more importantly, no increase over the last 25 years. That suggests several points. By the way, there are those who say this is because of a Haredi influx into Great Britain. They separated that out. In other words, if you separate out the Haredi community, the mixed marriage rate goes up by about 2 percentage points. That was relatively marginal. So that it's not a matter that Great Britain has become culturally transformed by a Haredi population. It's that mixed marriage in Great Britain, to some extent, has plateaued. It certainly has not gone on an upward spiral the way it has in the United States. The question then becomes, what is to be learned from this, and what do we walk away with? First of all, I'll suggest that there's nothing inevitable about mixed marriage. Sure, mixed marriage is a price of acceptance into the broader society. And Britain, like America, are liberal societies which grant full equal rights to Jews and full participation of Jews into the broader society. There is a price to be paid in terms, obviously, of assimilation. But the price is not an inevitable one. Ultimately, it still remains a choice of how Jewish one wants to be. Second, Great Britain has a remarkably high day school attendance rate. Jewish leaders have made a very big push to encourage attendance in day schools, particularly on the high school level. You can't prove causation here, obviously, but there's no question that during the adolescent years, friendship networks make a world of difference. They affect your attitudes towards dating and ultimately marriage. Thirdly, there's no question British Jews often feel much more vulnerable than their American counterparts, which in turn translates into lower mixed marriage. But, and this is the real point, I'm most impressed by the author of the study on British Jewry and the fairly low rates of mixed marriage. David Graham, the author, argued that what really is behind this is a culture of traditionalism within the British Jewish community. In other words, a sense that no matter how far we've evolved, we retain a sense of the importance of heritage, of tradition, of family, of identifying with where we came from. That culture of traditionalism is often lost in a society like America, where we tend to lack a sense of history, and we tend to say we're constantly moving towards a new era, a new culture, a new society. So that's the first step that ought to be taken. Take a look by comparison to what's happening in other liberal democratic societies. Australia similarly has a mixed marriage rate that is roughly less than half of what the American rate is. Again, day schools are a very critical component under those circumstances. Same is true of Mexico. Secondly, in choosing college campuses, we need to raise the question of how dense is the Jewish population. In other words, obviously, the college years are years in which people explore romantic relationships. More Jews means a culture in which you are more likely to find a spouse who is a future spouse who is Jewish. Fewer Jews, the odds become more remote. I question whether our people raise that question in choosing colleges. It's become a national sport to take your kids to every college campus that they're applying to. How many ask the question of what is Jewish life on this campus? More often I hear questions about what's the scenery like, what's the hockey team like, what's the library like, maybe not so much what the library is like, but I hear those kinds of questions. I don't hear nearly as many questions about what is Jewish life like in this area, in this university. Thirdly, our unfortunate norm within Jewish education is that it is largely a pre-bar mitzvah or pre-bat mitzvah affair, a pre-adolescent affair. This becomes a tragedy for several reasons. Number one is that precisely at a moment when our young people are able to encounter the relatively bookish culture of which we're the products, of which is our heritage, precisely at that moment when they're ready for that intellectual experience of what Judaic heritage is, that's precisely the moment they drop out of Hebrew school. Second, as I say, friendship networks during adolescence is a critical predictor of long-term Jewish involvement. It doesn't mean you're going to marry someone you knew in high school. That's relatively rare. But it means your pattern of dating, your pattern of friendships, your pattern of socializing have been done more within a Jewish milieu. Our norm is that Jewish education largely ceases with bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah. That norm is destructive in terms of losing young people precisely at a moment when they're ready for the kinds of discussions we're talking about in terms of future aspirations for dating and marriage. Fourthly, I did mention earlier that the normative crisis had become, one aspect of it had become neutrality towards conversion. direct opposite of what Rabbi Schindler spoke about 35 years ago. He argued then that when a mixed marriage occurs, conversion to Judaism ought to be the single best outcome, something we need to aim for. That language also has become relatively neutralized over the previous 35 years. The research here, though, is devastating. Over and over again, researchers, again, both on the more liberal side and the more conservative side, the one thing they agree on is that conversion to Judaism will not occur unless the Jewish side of the family, the Jewish community, is strongly encouraging of it. In other words, if the Jewish community doesn't want it or doesn't express its strong desire to see it happen, it's simply not going to take place because conversion marks such a radical step away from where you've been. Put it simply and more sharply, Sylvia Barrick-Fishman, Brandeis University, in a very important study of mixed marriage called Double or Nothing, one of her most compelling findings is that rabbis have become shy or hesitant to broach the subject of conversion, precisely because it's somehow or other implying that there's something wrong with where you are. Again, it's what I call the normative crisis, in which rather than becoming pro-conversion advocates, we become neutral towards it. And last, and perhaps most importantly, is that with all the data I've cited, the most encouraging piece of data is that a large majority of Jews continue to prefer endogamy, continue to wish for in-marriage. In other words, sure, there's been a collapse of values in terms of opposition to mixed marriage, neutrality towards conversion, neutrality to mixed marriage, yet the Jewish communal preference is still that they would like to see Jewish children and grandchildren. We need to build upon that preference rather than forget about it. In other words, language needs to be developed that encourages Jews to marry other Jews, to seek out Jewish partners, and ultimately to raise Jewish families. If we become neutral on the question, then filling the vacuum will be an American society that thinks mixed marriage is as American as apple pie. My last question, with this I'll conclude, is there a distinctive role here for the traditionalist community? I'd like to suggest that there is in several different respects. First, that I think Rabbi Novak will speak about this with much greater expertise than I and Rabbi Lopatin. Historically, there have always been two approaches to conversion. One approach is, which is perhaps the regnant approach today in Orthodox circles, is that you convert only those who are willing to become fully observant. The other approach, is teach a few major things, teach a few minor things, let the rest come in time, but do perform the conversion. Those two approaches have been in play for quite some time. The majority approach, I'd say, over the last 170 years, since the rise of Haredi Orthodoxy, clearly has been the maximal approach of do the conversions only when people have become fully observant. There are those right now who are arguing for the more liberal approach, which says try to be as inclusive and as encouraging of conversion as possible, rather than insisting upon full observance of mitzvot. The traditionalist community, which I say occupies the space between the right-wing Orthodox and the liberal movements, that traditionalist community, I think, has a definite role here in saying you can't, on the one hand, live in a bubble, as happens often in the Orthodox world, of mixed marriage doesn't happen. When it does happen, we'll find some way to have the conversion, but we can't become openly encouraging of conversion. That's what I call the bubble of it doesn't affect us, or as one Orthodox leader said to me a number of years ago, he said, mixed marriage has not hit the Orthodox community yet. Now, to some extent he's correct, but what he didn't realize is that mixed marriage is a crisis for the entire Jewish community, not for the Orthodox alone. What's fair to say is that that kind of Orthodox bubble of it's not affecting us, it's someone else's problem. If it does hit us, we'll find some way in individual cases. That's quite in opposition, in direct contrast to a communal policy that would be much more encouraging of conversion. In the non-Orthodox movements, as I said before, conversion as a normative value, people still want it. They would like to see it, but they've become neutral or they fail to encourage it. Second, I go back to the study of British Jewry by Dr. David Graham and the culture of traditionalism. Dr. Graham is arguing that why is the mixed marriage rates in Britain relatively low? not because of any particular program, of any particular initiative. It's much more part of a larger culture in which we've retained a sense of traditionalism and traditional values. The traditionalist community in America needs to be the centerpiece of that. A community that can argue that on the one hand, of course we're modern, of course we've integrated into American society, there are enormous benefits of that integration, but we come to that integration with a definite sense that Jewish tradition is worth cultivating, worth preserving, worth maintaining. 45 years ago, the late Dr. Charles Liebman, at the time the most perceptive observer of American Jewish religious life, wrote a book in which he argued that American Jews are torn between two values, two goods. The good of Jewish integration into America, that's the blessing of America, and the goal of Jewish survival, continue as a distinctive people. Intermarriage is an excellent barometer of whether those two goals can be kept in play at the same time. No one is saying go back to the shtetl. No one is saying build a ghetto wall around you. Obviously that takes place in the Haredi world in Borough Park. It's not normative for the rest of the Jewish community, nor is it realistic, let alone desirable for the rest of the Jewish community. At the same time, precisely because we want some level of integration, at the same time we're concerned with survival. For many years we said we don't have to choose. In other words, when Liebman wrote his book, he was greeted with strong statements of why should we choose? Both of them are goods, integration and survival. Intermarriage is a good test case of perhaps sometimes choices are necessary. I think the job of Jewish leadership is to make the Jewish choices so compelling and so attractive that our people will choose those rather than the paths of assimilation.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jim, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.